As operations managers, we have to make decisions, recommendations very quickly. So part of your job is to make observations, analyze data, and you often have to come to quick decisions to improve processes and to put out fires. So as we make decisions, we need to be aware of what influences those decisions and recommendations. So what we're going to look at is what is called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is the fact that your reasoning and your evaluation can be influenced. We want to look at how that's influenced. Because if it's influenced by facts and data, then that's great. Those are informed decisions. But if it's being influenced by things that it shouldn't be influenced, then our decisions are biased and our decisions are flawed. So we're going to look at some of the different types of cognitive bias here. Before we do that though, if you will please complete the worksheet that is attached to this video. There are 4 questions, and there's a question about Rudy, my cousin. There is one about best-selling novels, 2 college roommates, Victor and Mario, and the number of academic departments at Red Deer College. So if you'll just quickly read through those and answer the questions, you don't need to look anything up, just answer to the best of your ability. And then the rest of this video will use those as examples. So if you haven't completed this worksheet, please pause the video here, complete that, and then we'll discuss it momentarily. Alright, so let's assume that you have completed that worksheet. So now let's look at different types of cognitive bias and how our decisions and recommendations can be influenced. So we'll start with the idea of the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is where you think things because others do. So you've heard the term jump on the bandwagon. So the idea here is that you don't think you have all of the information, so you're looking to others who you think have more information than you do. So for example, with the coronavirus, what we see other people stocking up on toilet paper. Well, that must mean they know something that we don't know, and so we also go and stock up on toilet paper. So we're following others, we're jumping on the bandwagon, and often it's because we feel like they have some kind of additional information that we don't. The second type of cognitive bias we're going to look at is what is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where we focus on info that supports our theory. So in this case, we're ignoring everything else. We already have an opinion or an idea, and so we're simply cherry picking the evidence to support what we already have decided we want to do. And so we're ignoring the bigger picture, we're ignoring the greater facts, we're just looking for what actually supports the way we already want to go. The next type of cognitive bias is what is called focusing bias. Focusing bias is where we place too much importance on one area. We lose the bigger picture. So here our field of view is very narrowed, and so we're not seeing how decisions impact other decisions and the greater impact. If you were involved in the face-to-face version of this course, we had a guest speaker earlier this year who does emergency preparedness and incident command systems, and he was talking about when there's an emergency, your field of view goes from 180 degrees down to about 17 degrees. We can become very narrow in our focus and we lose sight of that bigger picture. You can think about that if you're driving down the highway and you come across an accident. What happens to your field of view? Well, you get very focused on the accident on the side of the highway, and you may or may not notice what the other cars around you are doing, if they've stopped, if they've pulled over, because your eyes are focused on that accident. You may not notice if there are deer or other wildlife that are about to try to cross the road. We get very narrow in our focus, we lose the bigger picture, and so when that happens, the decisions are very much focused on that one particular area and not over on the overall organization. To help us understand this focusing bias, we can look at our worksheet. And so the third question on the worksheet was about two college roommates, Victor and Mario. Victor and Mario are registering for courses for their spring semester. They leave their dorm room together, they stop and eat breakfast together, they chat with some friends, and then they arrive at the registrar's office at the same time. Now they're both trying to register for art history classes. Victor is told that the class he wanted is filled to capacity, and it was filled yesterday. Mario is told the class he wanted is also filled to capacity, and it filled 10 minutes ago. So who is more upset, Victor or Mario? Well, if you answered Mario, it's because you have focusing bias. You focused on that 10 minutes, and that informed your decision. Now, Victor and Mario, both, bigger picture, couldn't get into their class, right? But we get so focused in that little piece of information that, just if Mario had been 10 minutes earlier, he would have gotten in. But really, they're probably both equally upset because they both didn't get into their classes. All right, the next cognitive bias we're going to look at is what is called framing bias. And framing bias is where we draw different conclusions based on how the info is presented. So as an operations manager, a lot of times you're putting out fires, and these come to your attention because a subordinate comes to you and says, here's what's going on. But it's very important to recognize that your response and the decisions you make are going to be influenced on how that information is presented to you. And if we present it in different ways, you would come to different conclusions. So for example, in our worksheet, the first question talks about Dr. Power's cousin Rudy. So Dr. Power's cousin Rudy is a bit on the peculiar side. He's got an unusual taste in movies and art. He's married to a performer. He's got lots of tattoos. He likes to take yoga and collect records. He's a rather outgoing and boisterous person known to act on a dare. So the question here is, what is Rudy's occupation? Farmer, librarian, trapeze artist, surgeon, or lawyer? Well, you probably answered this question in one of two ways. You either said, all this information you're telling me about him says that he's a very creative person, so I picked trapeze artist. Or you looked at all this information and said, you're trying to trick me by telling me about how creative he is, and really he's the opposite, right? So his job is the other extreme, a more traditional type job, maybe a lawyer. In both cases, you're being influenced by the way we framed the story, by what information we told you. But all the information that you're being told has nothing to do with his occupation. It doesn't actually inform you at all as to the type of job that he has. But you either chose a more creative job or to go and find what you deem as the opposite of that. And in both cases, you're being influenced by the way it was framed. In the next type of cognitive bias, it's called observational selection bias. And observational selection bias is when we see things we haven't seen before, so we assume they must be happening more often. So we're hearing a lot more about plane crashes. And so a lot of the assumption that people make is that, there must be more planes crashing than a decade or two ago. But in reality, plane flight is safer than it's ever been. The difference is we hear about it more, so we think it's happening more. We're being influenced in our thinking. Same thing is true with child abductions, right? We hear about them, we get Amber Alerts, and so we assume that it's not safe for our kids to walk to school anymore, that things are not as safe as they were when we were children. But in fact, the number of child abductions is lower than it's ever been. In both the airplane and the child abduction case, we're hearing more about it because we now have global news. You can hear about events happening in other countries that we wouldn't hear about before. So it's not that they're happening more, it's just that we're hearing about them more. But it changes our perception because we didn't hear about it in the past. The next type of cognitive bias is what is called planning fallacy. Planning fallacy is where we underestimate a task or the amount of time it will take, so completion time. So I don't know about you, but I suffer from planning fallacy, right? You hear about, okay, I need to do this task, and you think, oh, well, that'll only take me half an hour, and 4 hours later, you're still working on it. So you tend to underestimate the time that things take, and this can impact us in operations because remember, you're planning and scheduling. How long will it take to implement a new policy? How long will it take to implement changes to your production line? Do you underestimate the time something takes or the amount of work that something takes? All right, we have two more types of cognitive bias we're going to look at. The second to the last one is what is called the anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is when you make decisions without information. So we look for an anchor. We're looking for some type of clue to point us in the right direction. So on our worksheet, let's look at question number 4. It says, how many academic departments are there at Red Deer College? Well, depending on which worksheet you got, your worksheet may say fewer than 15, more than 15. Or your worksheet may say fewer than 30, more than 30. Okay, well, we don't really care about the A and B choices here. All we care about is the exact guess that's below. And that's because if you had a question that had the choices fewer than 15, more than 15, likely your exact guess is probably somewhere between 10 and 20. For those of you who had a worksheet that said fewer than 30, more than 30, your exact guess is probably much higher, maybe in the range all the way up to, say, 50 or 60. Now, when we chose the 15 and the 30, these numbers are arbitrary. But because you don't know how many academic departments there are at Red Deer College, you're looking for any type of anchor, anything that will help inform your decision. And so we cling to those numbers, the 15 or the 30, to help us make what we think is a more educated guess. But we have to remember that sometimes that information is just thrown in there. It's random. It has no tie to reality. But it actually can influence the actions we take, the recommendations we make. All right, the last critical excuse me. The last cognitive bias that we're going to look at is what is called the availability bias. The availability bias is where we're going to focus on the options that we can relate to. Okay, so for example, in question number 2, it says, in one chapter of a best-selling novel, would you expect to find more words that end in ing or that have an N as the last letter? So we don't know, right, what best-selling novels have in terms of most common words. So what we tend to do as we try to make this decision is we try to think of examples in our head. And we tend to pick the options or make the decisions where we can think of examples, where we can picture it. If your subordinate comes to you and says, okay, we can do item A or B to solve the issue, you tend to pick the one that you can visualize, the one that makes more sense to you, the one that's more easy to understand. It may not be the best option, but we tend to gravitate towards the ones where we can think of examples or we can picture it in our mind. This is the availability bias. So in the question about the best-selling novel, you picked ending in ing, likely if you could think of more words that end in ing. And you picked N as the last letter if you could think of more examples of words that end in the last letter. So we have to recognize that we're being influenced by the examples we can think of. And so different people would come to different conclusions based on what examples they can come up with. So we need to recognize that decisions that we make, recommendations, opinions that we have are being influenced, and we need to know where that influence is coming from, so that we know whether or not the opinions, the recommendations that we have are valid, or whether they're being manipulated or influenced. So are your recommendations being affected by the fact that you're looking for any type of anchor? The fact that you may be looking at things and just going with what other people go with because you think they have more information than you? Are you focusing too narrow on one particular aspect or the way that the information is being framed to you? So as you think about the decisions and make recommendations, what is influencing those decisions and recommendations? Is it data and facts and information, or is it suffering from cognitive bias?